standpoint. There's two things you have to prioritize: your learning agility and your network equity. And I'll expand on each of those. The employer-employee relationship is an 18-month contract, and you should be very clear: if you come work with us, here are the things that we will get from you. Here are the things that you will get from us.
You've got 2,500 actuaries working for you, and you're advertising a position that's paying market rates, and suddenly it's a net 23% increase to the cost of your workforce. It's just not going to be a reality in a market where costs are so heavily scrutinized, and you're looking at individual and people costs.
There is not a single thing that will fundamentally change the world of work and our world at large like AI since the internet came to be.
Lars, welcome, buddy. Great to have you on the show.
Sam, it's good to be here, man. How are you?
Yeah, I am tickety-boo. It's been a great day here so far, and get in early with the English language isms, right at the front of it.
I appreciate that. We might need like a scroll at the bottom. It was like tickety-boo equals, something.
Yeah.
But I assume it's good. So
everything's good. Everything's good, man. Everything's good, and it's great to have you on. And I think, for those of the kind of industry that haven't come across you or haven't come across the work, the content and things that it is that you produce, it'd be lovely to just get an introduction to who you are and what you do for the listeners.
Yeah, let's see. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm the founder of Amplified Talent. So we do a mix of HR executive search, and we run a HR leadership development community called the Amplified Talent Community. It's for emerging heads of people and chief people officers primarily. Spent 25 years in the industry, first 15 years running recruiting and talent teams at Ticketmaster, Magento, and NPR. Been doing the entrepreneurial thing for the last decade, and then have some media stuff wrapped around this. So I've written a few books, have a column in Fast Company, and host a podcast on LinkedIn's podcast network called Redefining Work, where I get to talk to people that are much smarter than I am and much more accomplished, and really people who are kind of operating the vanguard of this new world of work, to learn a little bit more about what they do and how they do it and how they're making an impact.
Yeah, awesome. And echo that as well. And hence having you as a guest on the podcast. I'm always looking for people who are more experienced and have greater knowledge and depth of knowledge than I. So inviting you on, absolutely, buddy. And for those of you who aren't following, definitely, get you to subscribe and sign up to Amplified Talent, and follow the podcast as well, because it's awesome. And as ever, you look meticulous in your setup, and it's aspirational for me starting out here to reach those levels of audio and visual quality and content too. So
it's a long time. I worked at NPR for 3 years, so the audio, I had to invest in audio early. The video took a while to catch up, but yeah, it's been about 6 years in the making to get to the studio that I felt pretty decent about.
Yeah, and I think always admire NPR smashing it with Tiny Desk as well, like how they managed to capture that sound in that environment. That's what I live for, by the way. It's the only way I consume music. It's the best curated set. But anyway, without going too far down a rabbit hole, obviously we connected over the years. We spent a fair amount of time together at conferences, and I always love the ability of people like yourself to take a kind of zoomed out look, speaking to lots of interesting people from lots of different industries, lots of different perspectives, and being able to soak it all in, and potentially, flipping the script a bit and passing the microphone over to yourself as opposed to you posing the questions, and really dialing into the big conversation at the moment, which is the future of work, right? It's a real seismic shift in terms of the way in which people are engaging with work, massive shifts in terms of the way that people are employed, and tons that we could go into. But let's start off cliff notes on some of the kind of key themes. Like what do you think is the key theme coming out at the moment from the conversations you've seen?
Oh, wow. I think when you talk about, and I even try to avoid using the term future of work, because we're in it. Like, it's now. Like, it's not the future. It's like it's what we're navigating today. So certainly AI is a big part of that. I'm sure we'll get into that. Multi-generational workforce. 5 generations in the workforce right now. That's certainly impacting the makeup of our organizations, and perhaps even the expectations of employees of what work means to them. That's something that we have to navigate. Certainly in tech and in recruiting, we've seen, we've been living in an environment of layoffs for the last 2 years. We're still there. So I think that volatility in the market is something that is certainly here for now, perhaps here to stay for the near future until the economy completely turns. political and socioeconomic instability and uncertainty, right? We've gone through several wars and conflicts. We still are. That is something that we're navigating on a global basis. And then I think also just the nature of work itself and the expectations, like the nature of work. We wasn't long ago, like we've kind of moved on from these industrial era constructs, and that's not just remote and hybrid work versus co-located, but it's this notion that where employment is stable and it's solid, and we're going to be somewhere for 3, 4, 5 or more years. I don't know that that's the case anymore. And so I think it's also shifting both from an employer and hiring organization standpoint, how we think about the way that we deploy talent, but also from an employee standpoint, how they think about how they manage their careers and make them more resilient, which I think requires them to be a bit more selfish, frankly, about their own development and their own growth and what they're getting out of that employer-employee relationship. So the list is much longer, but I think those are a few things that certainly come to mind.
Yeah, and that's like, we could probably do a podcast on each and every one of those going deep, but it would be great to kind of scratch the surface of you. And I think let's pick up on that last point, right, in terms of individuals, like anybody listening, regardless of role, regardless of position. You mentioned that kind of narrative of like selfishness and this kind of employee-employer contract changing. So yeah, I'd love to delve a little bit deeper there.
I think I have kind of an operating ethos about the world of work today from an individual standpoint, right? Like an employee standpoint. There's two things you have to prioritize: your learning agility and your network equity. And I'll expand on each of those. Learning isn't so much like, hey, I can learn a new concept or a topic. The shelf life of skills is shrinking. We're going to be automating so much of what we do now with AI. It's the imperative of us being able to be much more agile in how we learn and where we learn, and being curious about learning has never been more important. But the demands of our job make that really hard. And so learning is something we all know we need to do. Like theoretically, like you don't have to, nobody's going to be like, no, I don't need to learn anything. I know everything I'll ever need, right? Nobody feels that way. So we all know we need to learn, but I think too many of us are like so slammed in our day jobs that we're like almost feeling like guilty about making time for ourselves to learn and improve and build new skills. And I think that's a big miss. It's a miss for our own careers, but when you think about it, it's actually a miss for our employers as well, because the more skills we build, the more things we bring to our employer, the more impact we should be able to have for our employer. So, I challenge people to reframe how they think about that. And then I think on the network equity side, I don't mean networking. Like that's a part of it. But when I talk about network equity, it's really being very intentional around how you build your network, around how you give value before you ask for value, about how you diversify the people that you have access to. And through that, the experience and the ideas and the capability that you have access to. And, I'll use an anecdote in this. I learned this early on in my career, back when I was running talent acquisition globally at Ticketmaster. I was being groomed to be the successor to the CPO. And so she was giving me some stretch assignments, including standing up a new internal comms function from the ground up. About 3 weeks into that, we announced the intent to merge with Live Nation, which is, multi-billion-dollar merger. They looked at the org chart, so they're like, hey, we don't have anybody in internal comms. Oh, you do. This guy, Lars. He's going to run the internal comm strategy for this multi-billion-dollar global merger. And I was like, and they told me, and I'm like, I'm going to what? Like, I've been doing this for 3 weeks. I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I had a moment of terror. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. I know people at that time. I was, living in LA. I knew a lot of people at the studios at Disney, Universal, et cetera, who had been through mergers or who led TA functions there. And I'm like, hey, who can you connect me with on your comms team that I can learn from? And, ultimately through that, it wasn't that I had that experience, but I had access to it because I had curated my network in such a way that when I was in a position of need and I had to ask somebody, I had that trust. I had built up that, that rapport with people in my network where they're like, yeah, I'm happy to introduce you to this person. And so through that, I use the term collective intellect. When you've built a diversified network, you have access to a collective intellect that you can bring to bear on the problems you're trying to solve at work beyond what you have in your head or your hands. And so for me, I was able to put together a proposal. I was like, hey, send me templates. Like, what can you send me? And I Originally they had a line item in the budget to bring in an outsourced consulting firm to help with the internal comm strategy. Once I made my pitch on how I would approach it, they took that money away and said, "Hey, we'll use this elsewhere. You've got it." And that was great. Like that was a very kind of formative moment in my career, because I realized that I would have never been able to do that if I hadn't been intentional around not just building a network, but building a diverse network where I had access to people with skills that I didn't have, that I could leverage in a situation like that.
Yeah, and I think that kind of point on collective intellect as well. There's a great quote from the French Revolution as well. It's like a person can spend their life with their nose furrowed between the pages of many books, and learn less than speaking to the person in front of them. And it's like, you've got all of these learned experiences which you're drawing upon. And sometimes, right, you used to see this in, the event days, the recruitment events company, you'd be sitting at a round table and somebody would say, "Oh, I've just been given this project, I've got no experience doing," and somebody would literally turn to them and go, "Did that 3 weeks ago. Let me send you something," right? And I can give you a bit of guidance along the way. And I think those 2 points are really well interconnected, right? It is your network value, but also that collective intellect plays into the learning agility. So what can you learn from other people? And you mentioned that piece on AI and kind of the skills life cycle shortening. I think the other part there is like critical thinking and the ability for human beings to look at information that's generated for them and understand, is that right or is that wrong? Yeah, definitely feeds into it. So I think two really great points for people there. Like zooming out again, when we're thinking about then enabling individuals. So individuals, yes, learning agility, critical, yes, kind of this collective intelligence, really, really central. That kind of management layer or the layer above, like how can you enable your teams to be prepared for a different kind of relationship to work?
Yeah. I mean, I think that leaders, in the framing that I just provided, they have to role model learning. They have to role model, we always talk about this notion of a growth mindset and how that's so important. And it is, but it's an abstract concept if employees don't see it and understand what it means in the context of your organization. So if you're a leader, you need to be doing this and you need to be talking about it. You need to be talking about what you're learning. You need to be talking about what you don't know openly and honestly. And hey, here are the things that I'm trying to learn. And like, that's okay. Like you have to create an environment where it's, for lack of a better word, cool to learn. It's cool to be curious. It's cool to try to understand things that you don't know. And it's also cool to say, I don't know, but I will find out and I want to learn. And so, from a tactical standpoint, you could have, learning events where you have, you kind of tap into your team and figure out who knows, who goes deep on a different topic and maybe have them do like lightning presentations to the team. You could carve out learning hours or even learning days on a regular schedule where, I mean, again, at an individual level, everybody listening right now, at a bare minimum, you should be blocking out 1 hour of your week in your calendar every week for learning. And that can be when you listen to podcasts that people have sent you. That can be when you read the latest research or white paper that came out. It could be when you catch up on, just different trends or news, whatever it might be. Learning a new skill, it doesn't matter. But like if you have that programmed into your schedule, it becomes systemic. It becomes part of how you work. And that I think is really key. So when you're a manager and a leader and you're trying to create that environment, build that in and role model that. Let your employees see that you personally value that, you're prioritizing that, and through that, they will ultimately be able to, have that kind of permission and cover to do the same.
Mm-hmm. And don't then book over the slot where you see somebody's blocked out some time for learning. Don't then, use that when you're trying to find space for that meeting, right? But I think that like that kind of enabling that almost it's one of the things which people may leave or stay in an organization for is like, what can I learn? What can I obtain? What are the new skills? How can I develop as an individual if you are really conscious about your career? And as much as there's a shelf life for skills, within some roles, within some organizations, there's probably a shelf life to like your existence and your happiness within that organization and your productivity. Like, how do you see, I suppose, learning agility playing an impact on maybe the length or the style of an employee-employer contract?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you teed up the other point that I had mentioned, which is around like taking a page out of Reid Hoffman's book, The Alliance, and LinkedIn's model of tours of duty. So, they've been doing this for over a decade now. And, I know at least a dozen people who've been working at LinkedIn in a variety of different roles. And the way that they approach this, and again, I think today it's probably 18 months, not 2 years, how they usually look at it. But I think the employer-employee relationship is an 18-month contract. And you should be very clear, if you come work with us, here are the things that we will get from you. Here are the things that you will get from us, and you have that open and honest conversation. And it's timestamped, it is an 18-month period. And you say at the end of 18 months, we'll reassess and we'll have an honest conversation. Is this still the right place for you? Are you growing? Are you learning? Are you having an impact? Are you happy? And then from the employer perspective, are you still the right person for us? Do your skills still map with what we're needing you to do? Are you having an impact? Do we see increased, capability for you in this role? And just having more of an honest dialogue around that. And if it's not, doing everything you can to help that person move on, either within the organization or elsewhere. And I think, again, it's a different way. Like we kind of have held on to these longstanding ideas of employment, which is like you come in, and what I'm stating also, I own that it is a US centric approach, right? We don't have the same types of contracts and safeguards and protections and notice periods that you have in the UK or in Europe or even elsewhere in the world. So I will own that my, this view is a bit of a US skewed view. But I think if you have that open and honest conversation early on and you're sincere about helping them move on if they're not the right fit for you or you're not the right fit for them, like in either one of those scenarios, that is the model of employment we should be aspiring to. Like we shouldn't be just hiring people with the assumption that they're going to be there indefinitely. Because again, I think a lot of people, especially in this market, they may go and maybe they don't like it, or maybe they realize you're not tapping into their skills, so they have no growth, so they're just going to sit and quit, but stay there, or you're letting them down. You don't see the potential in them. You don't see them advancing in their career. That's what they want to do, but you're content with them just building widgets in whatever job they're in. You're letting them down as an employer. So I think it's just reframing how we think about having open and honest conversations around what that relationship is.
Yeah, and I still think that's possible, right? There's definitely some legality challenges when you look at, other markets, particularly, across the channel for us on the continent. There's certainly some very tight employment laws in Central Europe. But nevertheless, still, when you're thinking about people's progression plans, it's possible to signpost, hey, there's another role for you, and like you can go into this position and potentially drop out and drop into another role. I think that's sensible one-to-one, maybe off the record conversation. It's like, if you're still not happy here, like let's have that conversation. Let's work out what is working. So I think, really sage advice. And as a bit of a segue, go on.
No, I was going to say, and I'm not an attorney, so do not consider this legal advice by any means, right? So that's my disclaimer. But I think even if you were to say like in the employee contract, baking that into it, having like a guaranteed 3-month severance, let's just say, for example, maybe they're not necessarily even on garden leave, they can just step out and do whatever they want. Like, being able to bake that in to the agreement so that you're saying like, hey, at this point in 18 months, we'll have this discussion. If it's not a fit on your side or ours, you have this 3-month package. And you could begin looking immediately, right? There's no kind of garden leave restriction. So that, again, not legal advice. I'm sure somebody will be watching this and be like, that's not actually legally possible. So I may be giving horrible legal advice, but, I would imagine there may be ways to think about how we even kind of bake that in to the employee agreement so that it's clear from the front.
And typically people at the start of their careers, right? We often see graduate programs and early careers programs and newly leaver programs where essentially you are doing that tour of duty. You're doing it in like tighter time frames. You're working from one part of an organization to another part, and you're finding your feet. You're finding your kind of piece in the puzzle and where you fit into the org. And then, potentially having a career from there, or maybe, cutting ties at the beginning of it. And we should be sensible enough to think about that throughout, people's roles and, kind of their journeys in work. And light segue into the kind of multi-generational talent setup. Obviously the retirement age is expanding in almost every single nation on earth. People are living longer, people are working longer, people are having more kind of portfolio careers. So even if they technically finish their full-time employment, they're still contributing to the workforce. Plus, people are joining the workforce earlier, and we've got this first time issue you put at the beginning, right? 5 generations in the workforce. So would love to dive into that, in the context of work.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an interesting time, certainly like we've never been in a position where we've had this many generations. actively participating in the workforce. It's funny, like the conversation around generations, I struggle with it sometimes because I think not we as in me, but like the media, let's just say the conversations and the narratives, we tend to like to tightly define generations and what their expectations are, right? And like, millennials want this, Gen Z wants this, boomers want this. And I think if you really look at those and you break down some of the data in different reports, like LinkedIn has some really good data around this. Everybody wants comp, everybody wants flexibility, right? Like everybody wants agency, and that's not saying, well, boomers want agency or boomer like. So like there are certain things that I think are pretty universal. I think where you do find differences is, maybe from the boomer generation to my generation and Gen X, like we came into the world of work with this notion that, you had to pay your dues, so to speak. You had to kind of take these steps to be able to move up the vertical ladder. We didn't have the same access to horizontal and lattice type careers like people do now. We didn't grow up with the internet. We didn't grow up with mobile devices. We grew up having to be more patient and resourceful to find some of this information. That I'm not saying that's either good or bad. That's just the nature of like the upbringing, where I think maybe younger generations now, like they grew up with real-time access to all of the information in the world. They grew up with a device in their pocket that could tell them anything they needed, then connect them with anyone around the world. And so that real time, they grew up with like streaming video and audio, right? So, hey, I want to hear this song from this artist. Cool. I'm playing it 5 seconds later. Like boomers didn't have that, Gen X didn't have that. I remember growing up and putting like, Scotch tape over cassette tapes so I could re-record, music over it. And I mean, like, that's fine, but it's just, I think that that access that we had in our upbringing, I think does somewhat color our expectations in the world of work. And I think that is probably one of the aspects of like generational conflict that I think, there is some truth to that, but I steer away from like the broad brush, like, oh, these generations only care about like corporate social responsibility and this and that. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. So it's difficult to navigate that. We had a conversation in our community a couple of weeks ago with somebody was talking about communication etiquette and Slack channels, and somebody who was a chief people officer was getting pinged by an associate level, kind of entry level role, and they asked a question in Slack, and like this person was in meetings, like they're a CPO, they're very busy, and like 20 minutes later they followed up with another question like ... Ooh. Right, like I'm still waiting, and she's like, hold up a minute, like this is and so they kind of had that conversation. It was like, look, we need to set expectations around like when you're using these channels, it's not going to be real time, and there has to be an expectation that unless it's something that is marked specifically as urgent, it may be a day, maybe 2 days before you get a response. And it was interesting just seeing, because in the community we have a weekly what we call peer power hour video chat where anybody can join, and we just talk about things people are working on, and those groups and the attendees are multi-generational. So it's interesting hearing like the different perspectives on that specific scenario. But I think those are the kind of things that we're navigating right now.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting, right? Because if you're walking up to the previous person's office, this remote versus hybrid setup, even with Slack withstanding, and you saw somebody was in a meeting or on a call, and you knocked on the door, you'd feel pretty embarrassed, right? You're like, oh, sorry for disturbing. You wouldn't then walk up again 10 minutes later and knock on the door again, would you? Like, that's just not how you'd respond as a human.
Right. Or just like stand in front of the window, right? Like I'm here, I'm waiting, right?
Yeah. With a little, flashing light to let them know there's a notification, right? It's just like weird. It's not how you'd operate. And
but I mean, to your point, it also speaks to, I think, like the hybrid and remote transition, where like, a lot of the people who've entered the workforce in the last 4 years have done that solely remote, or maybe hybrid. And so they didn't have the benefit of having those in-person office interactions that I think maybe helped you understand by seeing peers and contemporaries and just the dynamics of how people, interact. Like you didn't have that. So, you're going with kind of what which is, shorthand and A lot of things that don't necessarily port one for one to a corporate setting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's like that's definitely part of the challenge. The other part of the challenge as well is when we think about, pay scales, expectations, people that have been maybe in a career where they've been rooted in that for 20 years, in an organization versus somebody that's maybe jumping every 18 months. And, pay disparity is definitely another one when we think about, pay visibility, and US kind of leading the way in many, many ways in terms of salary transparency. Like, how do you think that plays into one, multi-generational workforce, but two, like the structures within an organization, the impact that potentially transparent pay could have?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I guess this will maybe be another point in the generational difference standpoint, but I think that again, getting back to that, like, I paid my dues mentality that I think maybe some of the older generations have. I think there's been more resistance that I've seen on pay transparency from perhaps some of the more experienced or older generation workforce, because they're kind of like, well, I paid my dues and I had to move from this and this, and like we don't want people to know that compensation. Like I think that's bullshit personally. Like, I've been advocating for pay transparency. I wrote a piece in Fast Company on it in 2017. I mean, it's something that I've been pushing for a long time. But there is some of that legacy mindset of like, hey, we don't want them to know that their peer is making X because we want to be able to negotiate as low of a comp that we can, or like, well, hey, this person is making 50K, and sure, our role is like 50 to 80K, but they're at 50. Let's just give them 55. Like, that's just a bump for them, right? And like, not like, well, what are their skills worth? What value do they bring? They're not thinking about that way. They're just looking at it pure from like, how do we make that number as small as possible, which is not the right way to do it. But I think that is, that is something that I think you do tend to find perhaps, split along generational lines, where like people who've been in the workforce longer, they had to pay their dues. They didn't have that visibility into other comp. That tends to be where you see, I think, some of the more fervent resistance to the notion of pay transparency.
And I think that there's definitely some friction there. I think there's also the stark reality, right? I'm for pay transparency. I think it's important, and I think people need to recognize different roles pay different things, and at different points of the journey that is life, different things will be in higher demand or lower demand, or there's a shortage of skills or an abundance of skills, and it will naturally have an impact on salary. I think the part that's a real reality though for organizations is you can't suddenly overnight increase the cost of your headcount, which is your most expensive cost, to bring it in line with market rates. So you've got 2,500 actuaries working for you, and you're advertising a position that's paying market rates, and suddenly it's a net 23% increase to the cost of your workforce. It's just not going to be a reality in a market where costs are so heavily scrutinized, and you're looking at individual and people costs. And as she touches on another one of those themes, and see how many I can remember from the beginning, but touched on another one of the themes, which was you talked about layoffs, and like, is this the new normal of that kind of way of working? So much of that is based on profit, loss, people costs, and output. So yeah, talk to me. What's your view? How do you see what's happened over the last 2 years, and what do you see coming?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that layoffs, obviously I know this is a recruiting heavy audience. I don't need to tell you all about what this market has been like over the last 2 years. I mean, I think recruiters are often the canary in the coal mine when it comes to layoffs. They're typically the first teams that are hit, and they're hit pretty hard. And we have been, as an industry, over the last 2 years. When I think about looking at the way the layoffs have been handled, particularly in tech, and I think we also do need to localize this a bit, where I think that, the majority of the layoffs we've seen have been in tech. I think that a lot of industries have been healthy and growing, but certainly tech has been hit particularly hard. What I think is a little different now, and I wrote about this in a piece for LinkedIn last month, I worry a little bit that layoffs are becoming normalized. It used to be that layoffs were kind of a last resort, and that there was, a clear stigma that companies that conducted layoffs carried, especially if they were shitty about it. I think that the sheer volume and frequency of layoffs in tech have normalized layoffs a bit as like part of doing business. Right. And I think in particular in the US, where we have, at will employment, we don't have the same safeguards around employee contracts that they do in other parts of the world. It's a very easy way for companies to make their numbers look good, at year end, or to hit certain milestones. It's something you can easily just carve out of the budget. And for many companies, that's one of the largest, expenses that they have. So I do worry a little bit that we'll continue to see that, and companies maybe being more cavalier than they should around layoffs. What I also think, though, is that particularly in tech, we kind of came from this environment of, growth hacking, right? And like blitz scaling and all these clever terms around like hiring as many people you can as fast as you can. And I don't know that that has ever proven successful as a model. There's probably some examples, but I think that a lot of the layoffs we've seen were the result of overhiring, right? Capital was cheap. It was easy to bring people in. And, that resulted in a lot of companies, I think, overhiring. And so a lot of the layoffs were kind of right sizing. And I think that kind of comes into another one of the points we discussed around like the nature of work and employment, I think is shifting, right? We used to kind of look at the way we solved talent needs and resourcing through the lens of like full-time equivalent people, like full-time people on payroll. And sometimes that's still going to be, many times that'll still be the right answer, but it's not always going to be the right answer. I think we're going to get more flexible around how we think about bringing in contractors or gig workers or outsourcing things to, third parties that may be able to just handle that without having to absorb the full-time headcount. So that's kind of my hope, is that I think companies will maybe think a bit differently, but I think it also reinforces the point for employees. They have to be more, even if you're a corporate employee, you have to think more entrepreneurially about your own career and your own growth and your own skills. And again, getting back to that notion of being selfish, if you want a resilient career, you have to be more selfish with how you think about the decisions that you make in your career and the companies that you join, and the ways that you join them in ways that mitigate that risk for you as much as possible. You can't take it to zero. There's no way, but at least mitigate that a bit.
Yeah, and I think that point on like normalizing, is it becoming normalized, is so critical here, because actually what you have seen is a lot of big tech that got a lot of the big press around this. Actually, when you look at share prices, have been pretty positive afterwards, which on one hand kind of perpetuates the challenge. I think the other part with this is, like you say, that frequency. I think that's so important to just double down on that point, because we came out of a period of overhiring, not just in tech, not just in startup land, right? I think that's important, like the kind of growth at all costs mentality versus the kind of progressive, more kind of sustainably aligned growth that you'd typically expect to see in businesses pre venture capital really accelerating over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. It's this kind of balance, right? And the drop off from the kind of peak of hiring post-COVID to that resizing, it's not just in tech, it's definitely part of it, but it's also across the board where organizations probably overhired and then, the retranching. And as lots of organizations do it, and there's lots of press out there, all of a sudden the stigma's not the same, right? You're not the only person in the room doing it. And it almost enables other organizations to take those steps. And there was obviously some really, really bad cases across the board where it hadn't been handled well. So I think one of the most important topics, and then that resilience and how you respond to it, again, central. So right at the opening part, and it's almost unavoidable, right, as a subject, and we kind of have to cover it in every conversation. I think it's important, right? I don't think we should avoid it when we're talking about any topic, because it invokes and imparts in every single part of the working life and potentially our personal lives moving forward. So you started at the front when we talked about future of work, or a different framing of it with AI. Love to get your lens on it. Love to get your thoughts, impact from here out. It's kind of been tapered through naturally, but if we were to zoom in on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there is not a single thing that will fundamentally change the world of work and our world at large, like AI, since the internet came to be. And that's not a bold statement on my part, right? I'm not going out on a limb and saying that, but I think I want to start with just underscoring how important I think it is. I think that we've reached a piece, like ChatGPT, AI, let's kind of go back a bit. AI has been around for a while. Generative AI has been around for a while. Certainly if you work with HR tech vendors, you've been hearing about them talking about AI for years, whether it was actually AI or not. But I think that we are, what's different now is the consumer grade generative AI that we have access to. So when ChatGPT was released in November 2022, that was like a turning point, I think, in the evolution of AI. And so, you started to see other LLMs be released, Gemini, Grok, throughout the course of 2023 as ChatGPT specifically and OpenAI became more advanced, and they released ChatGPT Plus, and then they gave the ability to create your own GPTs. So they had this whole new builder community as well for people that weren't even necessarily coders, but they could create their own GPTs. I've done that. I have multiple ones that I use every day. And so I think that we're at a point now where we're starting to see the impact of AI on jobs, right? You see Klarna and like their customer service AI, which is, reducing the need for customer service representatives. You're seeing, AI being deployed that can code and beginning to, take some of that coding responsibility. You're seeing, design. I was always like, design, that's a creative field, right? That's not going to be impacted. Filmmaking, it's a creative. Well, guess what? Like, obviously it is. And you see some of these clips that OpenAI is putting out from Sora, and it's incredible. And so we're in a new world that impacts everything. And the quote that I keep coming back to is, Scott Galloway had mentioned, AI is not going to take your job. Humans using AI will. And that to me is like the alarm bell for anybody listening to this, recruiters, HR, or business people in general. Like, you have got to be, when we get back to learning agility, if you're not spending some time every week experimenting with these tools, seeing what you can build, seeing what you can use them, you're already behind. Like now, you're behind now. We're recording this in April of 2023. You're behind now. Get on this like quickly, because again, I think when you look at tools specifically like a ChatGPT or Gemini or Microsoft's Copilot, it's not that what they're going to give you is going to be turnkey. There's all kinds of issues. There's bias. There's hallucination. You need a human lens to be able to review that. But it will give you a running start at almost anything. And if you're smart about how you use these tools and how you learn how to generate prompts that can give you the right results, you're going to save yourself a ton of time. And so there are just so many use cases. I mean, recruiting specifically, I was talking to, I was tweeting with Will Blaze, who's a recruiter in the US the other day, and he created a really clever custom GPT around when they bring candidates in for interviews, rather than this kind of black hole of candidate experience where, you hire one person and you tell everybody else thanks, but no thanks, and rarely give feedback. He created a custom GPT to take all of the raw interview notes in Greenhouse and format them in a pros and cons and key takeaways format that was anonymized, obviously, but something that you can then, the people who took the time out of their schedule to come and interview with you, you could then send them that, hey, we did end up going with, selecting another candidate, but here's some feedback from your interview that hopefully will be helpful for you in your job search, right? Like, sure, you could have done that manually before, but that would have taken a lot of time. And most people don't do that to begin with. So there's just a lot of barriers. Now, custom GPT, it was built GPT Plus, so there's no public information going into it. That's a really great way to do that. When you're kicking off a search and you're meeting with the different stakeholders of the search, and as a recruiter, you're taking notes around like, hey, what are we looking for? What are we avoiding? What's the dream profile? What are the skills they have to have? You can now take all of those raw notes, plug them into ChatGPT or whatever, have them build a job description based on that. Have the job description, now take that job description and build a structured interview plan based specifically on that job description, right? Like, these are all things that, sure, you could do manually as a human, but it would take you a lot of time. And now you can use these tools and do it in 10 seconds, 20 seconds within a human review, which you do need to then review. And again, we mentioned kind of bias and hallucination. You do need to audit that out. But it's just such a game changer for us, and it will only continue to be. So, like, ignore this at your peril. And I it's a drastic statement, but I'm sincere about it. Like, this is going to be a part of everything that we touch and do in the very near future. And if you're not aware of it, if you're not somewhat fluent in it, you're going to be at a real disadvantage.
Yeah, and I think it's a wonderful framing, and I also love like the real example as well. We spend a lot of time, building the echo chamber around the importance, and like a really practical example there as well. I kind of echo that as well. Like I think the interview part of the experience is one of the most kind of underserviced in terms of net new innovation for a long time. And you saw new tools come to the market, Equitas, MetaView, Honeit, that were really focusing on this a couple of years ago. And I think, you've got tools like that at your disposal. You've also got tools that can help augment that in a kind of more scrappy way, day to day. And I think, your advice is salient there when we think about actually your learning agility time. If you're blocking out an hour a week, hey, why don't you make 45 minutes of that something to do with AI, or let AI guide you on what you should be following or doing? And yeah, definitely stress that point as we come to the tail end of it. So dude, absolute pleasure having you on. I think my final closing remarks would be sign up to Amplify Talent, follow Lars online, make sure you check out his podcast. It's awesome guests, awesome content all the time. And it's been an absolute pleasure having you, buddy.
Yeah, Sam, it was great catching up. I appreciate the time. And good luck to all the party message to all of you. Like, good luck, hang in there. Like, I know this has been a rough 2 years we've been through. There are a lot of signs right now that we are turning the corner, that hiring is picking up, and obviously that's a great thing for us in recruiting. So you've been through a lot, hang in there, keep going. And again, there's a lot of tools that you can access that will help you out. And Sam, always good to catch up with you, buddy. So thanks for having me on.
Awesome, dude. See you soon.